In this series I'm going to be replacing my rear shock and upgrading the front forks on my NC750X. The rear shock is adjustable for spring preload. The front forks aren't adjustable at all. Now I've previously put spring preload adjusters on the forks, but that doesn't change the damping, of course, and really it's the damping that's the issue with the standard shock and forks. It's just too harsh. Now I've owned and ridden this bike for 4 years now. It's got 62,000 kilometres on it, and I finally decided to lash out and buy some new stuff. So I've decided to buy a YSS rear shock with a hydraulic adjuster for the spring preload. This one has rebound damping adjustment only, but I think that will be enough. The aftermarket shock, even in its standard form, it will be much better than the standard NC shock, which after all is just built to a price. For the front forks, I'm going to install these PD valves. They're cartridge fork emulators. Now these little valves go inside the forks. A little bit of faffing around to get these in. So in another episode I'll be putting these into the forks. Rumour has it that they make a difference, but we'll see. They weren't all that expensive, so they're a reasonable investment. So today we're going to be taking out the old fork. So today we're going to take out the old shock absorber and put in the new one. And in the next episode I'll go for a ride and see what difference it makes.
The first job is to measure the static and active sag of the standard system so that then I can compare it when I've got the new shock in. So with the bike on the centre stand, I measure with the shock at full extension. I want to record the before and after measurements. So, strangely, I put in before and after as the headings. Who says I'm an idiot? Static sag is the sag between the shock at full extension and the shock compressed with just the weight of the bike, whereas the active sag is after the rider sits on the bike. So I record the measurement of the shock at full extension, and then I get my attractive assistant to help me do the other measurements. This has got to be a first and pure luxury, to have an assistant helping me with a video. Norman happens to be a trained mechanic, so I've even got someone who knows what they're doing. So we measure with just the weight of the bike on the shock, and then I put my big lumpy self on the machine and we measure again. The shock has been built to my weight specifications, so it has a stronger spring than normal. Okay, let's record these findings. The static sag is 33 millimeters. And the active sag, 512. So the difference between the two is 23 millimeters. It looks like it's going to be difficult to get at that top shock mount. I can just see a hex bolt, on one side, on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, I can't even film it, but right up into there, there's a 17mm nut that I have to get to. So the obvious course of action is to take some side panels off, because usually when you take side panels off you'll get immediate access to the top of the shock. But I find that that side panel is so convoluted. I have to take the seat off, the red side panel, and then the black plastic side panel. So I thought, oh, bugger that. Let's have a bit of closer look to see what we're up against before I go to that sort of trouble. By just taking the bottom screw out of this panel, there's enough flex just to be able to have a look up underneath to see whether it's going to help. And yes, there's a hole right through the frame that you should be able to get a long extension socket into, and there's the offending nut. So on the right hand side we're good to go. However, on the left hand side there's no straight access to that hex bolt. So we've got the long extension on the nut on the right hand side. On the left hand side we've had to use a tool from Norman. I didn't have one. It's a 3/8 drive with a universal joint on the end for the hex drive. So with the attractive Norman holding onto one side, I'm able to crack the nut and take that nut off without any trouble. There's the offending nut. So, job's a good one. Not taking the bolt out of the top yet. Want to take the bottom mount off the shock now. I think probably we'll have to take those two bolts out, but I'll just try taking the shock bolt out first and see how we go. But first thing is to jack up the swing arm, because as soon as I take that bottom shock bolt out, the swing arm's going to fall onto the ground. I don't want that to happen. Because I've taken the weight of the swing arm and the back wheel with that jack, I can pull that bolt out without any problems. Alright, so the bottom of the shock is free. And we'll take out the top bolt, the hex on the end of it, and see how we go getting that shock absorber out.
And no, we're going to have to take this one off because I can't get the spring out. Can you see what I'm doing there?
So I did have to take both bolts out, but once that's done, the shock absorber falls out happily. Filthy grotty thing it is too. So here's the old and new. I actually found that the centre between top and bottom for the new shock is 310mm and the old shock is 300. Wonder what difference that's going to make. I guess we'll find out in the end. So I thread the hydraulic adjuster up and then am able to get the shock absorber up back into position.
Yeah, it's going to come in, I think. Oop, there we go. Lovely.
With the shock in position, it's just a matter of putting the top bolt back in and then the two bottom bolts. And of course giving them a bit of a grease before I do that. But while I'm at it, I may as well grease this bearing while I'm here. There are needle bearings in there, so I'm going to put some grease on both ends and then just push that tube back in, which will push the grease right through. Aha! The dog bones don't line up with the hole. This will be because of the different length of the shock. So I jack up the swing arm a little and then can get the bolt in. What effect will this have on the static and active sag compared to standard? I wonder. With the bottom tightened up, I can now tighten the top up. Of course, an experienced person would use a torque wrench for all this, but as you know, I'm not an experienced person, so don't do what I do. The last job is to mount the hydraulic spring preload adjuster. Unfortunately, the way it comes is not able to just bolt onto the bike. I'm going to have to build a bracket. There's a threaded hole already here that I can use, so I'm just going to make a simple right angle out of some aluminium, then drill a couple of holes in it, and Bob's your uncle. I could whinge about the fact that this shock absorber is not built specifically for this model, but it's not a big deal, and besides it makes me feel important if I can build something myself. And I can find a lot more important things to whinge about than this. Like, is the beer cold, or is tea nearly ready? The list of more important things is endless. So I mark where the holes are supposed to go, drill them, and now I'm ready to assemble. Got some nice new nuts and bolts and some spring washers to go with them. You'll notice that I'm not having to hold the camera with one hand while trying to do the job with the other. My attractive assistant Norman is doing the camera work for me. Job's done, and that hydraulic spring preload will be really useful when we go camping and I put a whole lot of crap on the back of the bike. I'm leaving the spring preload at its softest setting. I've put the damping adjustment in the middle position. I'll see how that goes, and then I'll play with it if I'm not happy. Now let's measure the static and active sag again. First with the spring at full extension, then with just the weight of the bike, and then with my big lumpy self on it. Okay, what have we got? Spring at full extension, 558. Very interesting. 10 millimeters less than standard. The shock was 10 mil longer. That's sort of counterintuitive, but I think because of the way the bottom mounts work, that makes sense. However, with the bike's weight, it comes out at the same. So we've got 23mm of static sag. That's pretty good, I'm happy with that. Find that the active sag is the same as it was before. Very spooky. I'm very impressed that they've able to make the spring and shock, etc., work out this accurately. So we've got 23mm of active sag as well. That's really in the ballpark, and I'm happy with that. Well, there was a bit of faffing around to get at the top mount of the shock, but apart from that, everything went nice and smooth. Here's what the old shock looked like. And now the new shock. When I jump on it and jump up and down, oh, that feels really nice and firm but compliant. It'll be interesting to go for a ride and see how it actually performs on the road. So watch out for part 2.